I want to kind of ask a framing question because I find it interesting. How many people live in the United States today? Does anybody have any idea? Yeah. What do you think?
About 330 million.
Yeah, right. How many households?
140 million.
Yeah, a little less than that, but not too bad. A lot of people don't know how many people we have. Annual population growth has been about 1%, about 1%. Not recently because of the Great Recession, but for years we would grow at about 3 million people a year. 1 million from immigration and 2 million from births over deaths. So I'm not sure I thought about any of this stuff when I was getting into the business. But you're blessed in the United States to be in the development industry or in the real estate industry because we are arguably the only first world country with population growth, which gives you households that have the opportunity to buy a house or to rent an apartment and have the income to pay it. So my whole career has been in the United States, although I did work a little bit over in the Middle East when I was in the construction business. So I'll give you a little bit about my background and some lessons learned, and then talk to you a little bit about what I'm doing today, and then open the floor. And if you guys want to ask questions while I'm talking, feel free. If you want to save them, that's great. So I grew up in Arlington, Virginia, in a modest family, 800 square foot house. Parents did not go to college. I was gifted enough as an athlete to get recruited and actually ended up at the Naval Academy. I was telling the dean, played 2 sports there for 4 years, wanted to be an aviator, and Navy said I wasn't physically qualified to sit on my butt and fly a plane. So for whatever reason, that launched me into the Naval Supply Corps school, and ended up leaving the Navy after 5 years, going to Harvard Business School and getting into real estate, which largely I've been in for the last 40-odd years. Great profession. Real estate is a very big industry. You know, it is simplistically broken in my mind into residential and commercial. But if you think about residential, it's a really broad industry. I've been in the multifamily housing part of it. I think I've been involved in building more multifamily housing than anybody, 250,000 units, because Trammell Crow Residential was a national company. I had 23 offices at one point in time, and we were the largest apartment developers in the U.S. for most of the last 20 years. I retired 5 years ago. But I had a great time there, and I owned Trammell Crow Residential with the Crow family. Has anybody heard of Trammell Crow? You guys heard of Trammell Crow? Trammell Crow is dead. Trammell Crow was a man. I've had people come up to me and say, I knew Mr. Trammell, and I knew Mr. Crow also. And I said, no. Trammell Crow, he's an entrepreneur from Dallas, Texas, a really charismatic guy who, in my mind, created the partnership concept as a way of being in business in real estate. When I got out of business school, when I met Alan's dad, I was first in Hilton Head Island, South Carolina. Sea Pines Company, Sea Pines Plantation. Has anybody been there, into Sea Pines? Just a couple of you. So it's a great resort. It was interesting because Charlie Frazier, who was a Yale lawyer and had been in the service during the Korean times, came back to Hilton Head Island, which was an island in South Carolina, and his father had owned it, and they partitioned it, and Charles built Sea Pines Plantation. Was a resort second home community. And so I came there shortly after business school. It was really great for me because I love playing golf, and it was on the ocean and all. And Charles had gotten Sea Pines Plantation from his dad with no debt on it. So we began using Sea Pines Plantation's assets to generate cash flow. We were a lot sales company. We were selling single-family lots and condominiums. And then we bought Hilton Head Plantation at the other end of the island, and I financed that, as I was the finance guy, with the mortgage REITs of the early 70s. And you talk about some insane financing. you could borrow 100% of your cost, including an interest carry for 3 years, and your overhead, and overhead to send back to the parent company. And you had to put nothing down. You could borrow 100%, maybe 102%. And you borrowed it at somewhere between 4.5% and 5.5% over prime. They used to index to prime back then. And, you know, Citibank and First Chicago, Barnett Bank, others created these REITs. A lot of bank-sponsored REITs. It was a loan-to-own program. You heard of loan-to-own programs? When you do 100% debt, you're probably going to end up owning the project. And part of the problem for us at Sea Pines was we had a really thin to non-existent equity base. I always tell people that we practice the golden rule at Hilton Head, at Sea Pines. The golden rule is $1 borrowed is $1 earned, $1 refinanced is $1 saved, and $1 repaid is $1 lost forever. That was our logic for financing real estate. And it didn't work very well because the first recession, 1974, prime went to 12.5, our borrowing costs went to 17.5, the economy shut down. The Fed used to, gotten a lot better now, but the Fed used to, whenever inflation reared its ugly head, the Fed used to just step on the interest rate, the short-term interest rate curve, and drive interest rates up. And so if you can imagine, you know, you're 3 years into a loan, your interest reserve has run out, you're selling 400 single-family lots a year at $25,000. So you got $10 million a year in free cash flow before overhead. And all of a sudden it goes from 400 lots to 40 lots. And your interest goes to 17.5%. So we were bankrupt almost overnight. You know, not a good model. You know, the takeaways for me, the business is cyclical. And you guys, if, you know, I've written articles for the Wharton Real Estate Review, and one point I make over and over again is our economy is cyclical. And no matter how diversified you are geographically or product type-wise, when you have a great recession like we had in 9, 10, 11, everything gets hit, some worse than others. And if you have over-leveraged your product and you don't have a way to make the interest payment, you're going to lose it. And if you personally guaranteed it, you're going to get sued under your guarantee. So I learned that the economy is cyclical, particularly the second home industry is highly cyclical, although the first home industry is more cyclical than I thought. I thought that's where I'd go and it would be less cyclical. And it is less cyclical, but it's still affected. And you got to watch leverage. And at that time, you really had to watch floating rate debt. You know, 5 over prime floating. The prime rate had never gone up to, you know, beyond 10, but it went to 12.5, and it goes high at the same time the market shut down. So I left Sea Pines thinking, oh my gosh, maybe I should get out of real estate. This is a really dangerous business, fraught with a lot of problems. I loved my time at Hilton Head. We built condos, we built communities, and it was great fun. And one thing about real estate, particularly in the development side, is it's a visual business. You know, you can see what you're building. If you build a condo project or an apartment project or a community, you know, you can see it. And so there's a tangible aspect to it that's really nice. Instead of getting all the way out, I went to Dallas, Texas. Is that wind? What is that? Really? So instead of getting out of real estate, which I was inclined to do, I was shell-shocked. I went to the construction business in Dallas, Texas. I went to the Henry C. Beck Company as their chief financial officer. And I was kind of the only MBA they'd ever had. I was not really a good fit in this macho construction business, but it was an interesting part of the country. As you all may know today, Texas is doing terrific. And the company was a solid private company. Sea Pines had gone public, and I had really lost interest in public real estate companies. I think the REIT format is a good format for being public, and it's a way to own properties, but it's really hard for most real estate companies in a cyclical business to have continuously growing earnings. So we had that pressure at Sea Pines, and I was happy to go to a private company. And we didn't have to report to stockholders. We just acted in good business terms. And when I was at Beck, I got a little bored because I didn't really participate in the mainstream of the business. But I learned some very valuable things for my career at Crow. I don't know, have you guys had construction in any of your courses yet? So you know the difference between a fixed price contract and a cost plus guaranteed max? Do you know that? Okay. So I learned things at Beck for 3 years being their finance guy that really served me well in my development role because I chose to be in the construction business at Trammell Crow. And Allen's company, which is a successor company to Trammell Crow Residential, still builds their own product. I learned that if you have a fixed price contract and you're the contractor, if there are any savings, you keep them all, right? So as a developer who hires contractors, I would never give a fixed price to a contractor because, you know, if you do, he'll inflate the price and keep all the savings. And we, in fact, had some years. I remember our office down in Boca Raton in some tough years in the early 90s when the projects that we built were worth less than we spent on them. But we'd make $2 or $3 million on construction because we had fixed price contracts. Interestingly, the financial community figured out that they shouldn't allow you to have fixed price contracts. So now everything is almost a cost plus guaranteed max where there's a savings sharing. If the contract is for $30 million and the contractor brings it in for 29, you split the savings, usually 25% to the contractor, 75% to the owner. So I learned some things about construction contracts and the legal side of it that made me not disinterested in being in the business, but very wary about it. Also, Henry C. Beck Company at that time was a commercial contractor, and so it built shopping centers and office buildings and hospitals and some big retail. And their pre-tax margin was like 2%. Some years less. I'll tell you an MBA story. This was really funny. So back in the high inflation years of the early 80s, when I went there, Mr. Beck had all the company's cash in a non-interest bearing account at First National Bank in Dallas. And he was on their board. I don't know whether that was a statement he was making, but you know, nobody was used to having much interest. There was no inflation in the 60s and all, so interest rates were low, like they are today. But if you all may remember, prime went to like 21.5 in 1981, and so I started getting the company's cash. This is the biggest contribution I think I made to the company. I started getting their cash because we'd get paid a couple $1 million by the owners for a draw. And so I'd immediately get that money deposited because short-term rates at that time were 9, 10, 11. And then I'd pay out to the subcontractors, you know, on a regular schedule, but we never paid anybody early. And so the second year I was there, the interest rates, the arbitrage we made more money than the construction company. It was just a moment in time. But if you had any interest in any idea what was going on, you saw Mr. Beck has all the money in a non-interest bearing account. And as rates ran up, you could get 7, 8, 9, 10 for overnight deposits. I remember a time buying mortgage rates down to 12. I mean, you know, if you guys look at, you probably should look at the history of rates and housing and things like that if you're interested in housing. It's been incredibly cyclical and different. So I learned the construction contract formats. I learned cash management. I learned the tax structure. We actually had a company in Saudi Arabia. I worked over there a little bit. And then I was a little bored, and I got an offer to become a partner at Trammell Crow. One of my Harvard Business School classmates had become the managing partner of the residential companies. And I know Crow had a reputation for being very partner-like and very generous. Trammell himself, who I had the good fortune to work with for a little while, he'd be about 100 now if he were still alive. He unfortunately had Alzheimer's the last 15 years of his life, but he was a charismatic, generous guy, and he wanted all his partners to get wealthy. And so when I went to Trammell Crow, he loaned me the money to start Crow Terwilliger Company in Atlanta, and I had the East Coast as my territory. And I owned 40% of the company. So it was a hard move for me to make. Risk-reward frequently works out. I was in Dallas making $100,000 a year in 1978 with a country club and a city club and a car. Whenever we flew first class. So I didn't own any of Henry C. Beck. Mr. Beck owned it all with his partner. But we had big benefits for the officers. It's kind of a different way to compensate people and keep people, I guess. When Mr. Crow offered me a job to move to Atlanta and start my business, the salary was $60,000. And there was no security, right? Because there was no company. He would lend me, I think, can't remember, $500,000 to start the business. And so I was really nervous about making that move because I had a daughter and I didn't know that I should make that move. But I always remember my dad telling me that he regretted never taking a risk. My dad tells me that Bill Marriott, when he started the Marriott and he built that first Marriott at Key Bridge, offered him a job and he wouldn't take it. He just wouldn't. He was a product of the Depression. He wouldn't take a risk. And it always resonated in my mind. So I'm 38 years old, and I'm thinking I'm going to go from $100,000 in a secure company to $60,000 in an insecure company to become an entrepreneur, to be a CEO. I didn't know if I could be an entrepreneur. It sounded like an exciting thing to do, but you got a family to be responsible for. But I took the leap partly because of my dad's comments. And it was a partnership culture, and I tried to perpetuate that the entire 30 years I was there. For the first 5 years, I ran the East Coast, and then I was asked to run the national company, and I ran Trammell Crow Residential for the next 23, 24 years. And we had a lot of people get wealthy, and the way it worked was the Crow family and I kept somewhere between 40 and 50% of the business, and the other 50%, all the partners like Alan and the senior partners, they had that ownership. So we had what I characterize as an alignment of interest. If there's one thing I've learned in business, that is you need an alignment of interest with the people you're doing business with. And the closer that alignment can be, the better off you are. So in our case, once the partners in the business got wealthy, and much of their wealth was in the business with us, if they did a bad deal, they lost proportionally. And if they did a good deal, they gained proportionally. So that the Crow family and I, because the Crow family wasn't really even involved in the business, they let me run it. But, I was running it from 40,000 feet. And I was keeping track of the risk we were taking. But I wasn't the guy choosing the architect, choosing the dirt, designing the project, supervising the construction, supervising the management. My partners were doing that. But they were all owners in the business. So we had an alignment of interest. And if we made money, we all made money, and if we lost money, we all lost money. It was a great experience. I started with them right at 79.80. I went through those incredible high interest times, gasoline lines. You guys are too young to remember any of this, but it was crazy, and I had no background to know how unusual it was. If you look back on it, the Fed has kept interest rates under reasonable control, I think, ever since 81. Is that right about? But that was 74, 75, and then 80, 81. You never knew where they were going. And the economy would get put down. So I always managed the business with an eye on the economy. And my mantra is, there's going to be another recession, and you're not going to see it coming. I always kind of visualize it like you're galloping across the plains, and the next thing you know, you're over a cliff and you're looking back up saying, where did that come from? Because you don't see it. I mean, it could come from a crisis in Asia. The last one came from, largely, a big bust in our home market here. I mean, the insanity that went on in the 2003 to 2008 time frame in residential housing in this country was just unprecedented. People thinking that house prices always went up. I mean, you guys are probably now at a point where you're going to be thinking about, if you don't have too much student debt, maybe here you don't, because it seems like talking to your dean, your tuitions are reasonable. But I know if you go to Vanderbilt today, I think the tuition's like $55,000, and then you got to pay for being there. So It's really expensive to go to a lot of colleges, and a lot of kids come out with $100,000, even from business schools, $150,000 in debt, and they're going to defer that home ownership dream for quite a while. But I think what you need to do, whatever business you're in, wherever you choose to go and however you do it, is you've got to realize that we're going to have another down cycle, and you won't see it coming. That's my premise. So what I did at Trammell Crow Residential is I said to my partners, we're going to be in business for the long haul, and we're going to get rich slowly together. We're not going to swing for the fences. My brethren over at Trammell Crow Commercial, Trammell Crow Company, were personally guaranteeing construction loans on spec high-rise office building. You know what spec means, right? No pre-leasing. And so they went into the tank like everybody did in 74, 75. They survived, and by 77, 78, the Trammell Crow Company was the largest commercial developer in the country again. It kind of skidded through the 80, 81 high interest rates, but they went broke in 88, 89 because they were so exposed to these open-ended guarantees. And so I saw sea pines. I saw an island community just destroyed. I had to lay off, when I was president of Sea Pines Plantation, virtually everybody in the development business. I had a development staff of 42, and about 3 weeks later we had a part-time person because we had all the lots at the current sales rate we'd have forever. So however you guys go about choosing a career, and if you're lucky enough to be an owner or an entrepreneur, remember it's a cyclical business and you're not going to see it coming. So I was telling Alan at lunch, of all the projects that I've developed, and there's probably 900 apartment projects I was responsible for, we got comfortable with 25% equity, 75% debt. And what happened in recent years, and hopefully it will continue to happen with a little bit of a lag, is the economy goes bad and interest rate on the short end fall. As you all may know, construction loans are typically pegged now to LIBOR. In the good times they may be 150 over LIBOR. When the banks come back, they may be 250 or 300 over LIBOR, but they're usually today around 200 over LIBOR. LIBOR is virtually nothing today, right? It's nominal. So our construction loan rates are like 2.5% today. They're incredibly low. So when we hit 2008, 2009 in the apartment space, but I think the office space and the retail and others are somewhat the same. The thing I like about apartments is there are no see-through apartments if they're good apartments, right? You can build an office building and deliver it into a bad economy and you'll never get leased up for years, and you'll probably lose the building. But the apartment buildings that we built over a bunch of cycles, if they're well located and well managed, you'll lease them up, but you'll lease them at a rate. You guys are probably in apartments. Who's in a rental apartment here? Any of you all live in a rental apartment? Yeah. So a bunch of you know this. And I don't know what happens in the school environment. I built a lot of student housing. In fact, just sold one in Charleston at University. But in the market rate business, which we're in, instead of rents going up at 3% a year, you've got to give a month or a month and a half or 2 months free. So your effective rent is maybe 80% of what you thought, but your expenses are never going to go down. Maybe they'll adjust taxes. So you end up, instead of yielding 8% on your apartment project, you end up yielding 6%. But if you've got 25% equity and a bank loan that's 200 over LIBOR, even if LIBOR started out at 5, LIBOR will drop into a recession. So my point is, you got to be a good risk manager. If I ever got any feedback of anything I did well at Trammell Crow Residential over the years, is I managed our risk. So that when 91, 92, 93 came, big recession in those years, 3 years where you could virtually get no financing to develop anything new, we survived that because while we had to cut our overhead a lot, we were able to manage the debt service on our apartment properties and not be bankrupted. So don't over leverage. Now what kind of careers to have? I kind of, because I went with Trammell Crow Residential, ended up in the residential space. In good years in this country, we always say we need about 1.2 million new residential units a year. We got up to $2 million a year. We overbuilt back in 2005. The single-family business was crazy, and the mortgages were available with nothing down, and it was a really bad period that hurt so many families. But residential is a great place to be, and right now, while we're only building in this country 1 million units a year now, the apartment space, which Alan and I work in, we're back to where we were before. We're back building about 300,000 new apartments a year. Some of them are affordable, but most of them are market rate. Because young people such as yourselves are more likely to rent, at least in the short term, either because you got student debt or because you're not sure home ownership is a ticket to appreciation, or because you're mobile and you don't want to get trapped into owning a home or a condo when you may have to move to another place to get a job. So the outlook for rental housing is terrific. The development business is fun. It's where there's a lot of money made, but there's also a lot of risk. The condo business is pretty good, but it's very dangerous. I'll tell you another war story. We built the St. Regis in Atlanta, St. Regis Hotel and Residences. Atlanta's a relatively inexpensive town, but it's 7 million people now, and Coca-Cola and UPS and Delta, and biggest airport in the world. So we built a very high-end project right in Buckhead, if any of you know Atlanta. And we had 38 deposits of 20% out of 51 units. So my company invested $5 million in the deal, and we had some options on land around it. Took us a long time to get the project built. You got to think about when you make the investment in the land to when you finish and deliver the product. How long is that going to be? In the West Coast, if you're trying to zone in California and San Francisco, or in parts of the Northeast, that could be 4 or 5 years before you can even start your project. So you have no idea what kind of economy you're going to deliver into. In the case of Atlanta, it took us almost 3 years to get this project built. And by the time we delivered it in 2009, the prices as the buyers perceived it had fallen below the 80% threshold. So they had 20% down, only half closed. The rest of them walked away from $300,000, $400,000, $500,000. A lot of money in Atlanta, Georgia, to walk away from. But they couldn't sell their houses to move into the residences at the St. Regis. So we ended up, I actually negotiated with Morgan Stanley to let us use the forfeited deposits to carry the project. And we were able to carry the project for another 1.5 years, but the market never got better at the high end. And so we finally sold to an investor and got half our equity back, and we're lucky to get that because the hotel was doing very well. So timing is really important, and the longer the horizon is stretched out, the more risk you got, because the more uncertainty there is into where you deliver it. So I like the residential business. You can be in real estate, all the people that play. You got contractors, you got land planners, you got architects, you got the brokers who buy and sell the properties, you got the brokers who bring the financing. You guys could go to work for a bank. I always think it's a good place to start is to work in a bank real estate department and get a better sense of the industry and all the players, and a lot of times bankers will then go join a company once they see it. You got appraisers. And then you got the whole commercial side. You've got retail, you got strip retail, you got the malls, you've got specialty buildings like medical buildings, you got industrial. Crow used to be really big in industrial. You got office. I built 3 office buildings. I don't particularly like the business because it doesn't seem like there's a lot of cash flow in it, because the tenants are always demanding the fit up that takes a lot of your cash flow. You got the hotel business, which is doing pretty good again right now because the economy's back. So you got a lot to think about where you go, and I don't know how many of you have sorted it out, but I kind of got pushed into the development business because that's the opportunity I had. And then after I got there, I realized that that's where a lot of the wealth creation was. And I was fortunate to go to work for a guy like Trammell Crow who offered partnership, who wanted his partners to get wealthy, who wanted to get the best people in the country. And as I think Alan would tell you, we rarely lost anybody we wanted because we were very generous in terms of sharing the upside. The Crow family and I had the rising tides philosophy, you know. If the partners make a lot of money, we're going to make a lot of money. And so let's get the best people and give them that incentive. A little distracting here. One of the other things I wanted to tell you all about, because this is the soapbox I'm on recently, just a FYI, and then I'll entertain questions. I have been spending a lot of time recently on federal housing policy. I gave a lecture at Harvard recently called the Dunlop Lecture. And Mel Martinez, some of you may know Mel, he's a U.S. Senator from Florida, former housing secretary, a good friend of mine. He gave the one before. But I picked on U.S. federal housing policy. In this country, you might be interested to know, we have $200 billion a year we invest in subsidizing affordable housing. You all, I'm sure, are reading about the inequality in this country and how, you know, the wealthier people like me are getting wealthier and the poor are getting poorer and the middle class is getting squeezed. So we have 20 million American families who pay more than half their income for housing. 20 million. That's 20 million out of, you know, 120 million households. That's a lot, 1 out of 6. I argue that we are in a housing crisis, that we're one of the worst housed countries in the first world. And we spend this $200 billion a year, but over half of it goes to the mortgage interest deduction, which you guys may be interested in when you own a home. If you itemize, but only about a third of the country taxpayers itemize. So they're the only ones that can benefit from it. And guess who it benefits? Well, it benefits the wealthier Americans. You know, 75% of the benefits goes to people over $100,000. So you got, you know, 20 million families spending more than half their income on housing. 9 million of those, incidentally, are homeowners, and 11 million are renters. And we're spending all of our subsidy, 75% of our subsidy, on homeowners. Second homes and boats, you know, you can get a deduction for those. It's absurd. I mean, it is a joke. This federal housing policy, in my opinion, is ridiculous. So I'm going to spend the next 3 or 4 or 5 years of my life trying to get it changed to help those who need help, because they're not being helped now. Housing, you know, is a fundamental need. I chair the Global Capital Campaign for Habitat for Humanity. I was the international board chair for Habitat. And I see how foundational housing is and how many families are house poor if they even have houses. We have about 700,000 homeless in our country each and every night. But we have these 20 million families who are spending, you know, you make $24,000 a year and you spend $13,000 on housing, you know, before taxes, before clothes, before food, before, you don't have money for much anything. So as you all think about what to do in philanthropy, that's probably not at the front of your minds. When I retired in 2008, I decided to become a philanthropist. I made a $100 million gift to Habitat for Humanity when I die. And so I hope they don't cash in too soon. But when I die, I'm going to give that to Habitat, and I'm going to give the rest of my money, except for what I give my daughters, my grandkids, and my wife, but most of my money is going to charity. And so I encourage you at your age to think about helping others when you can. Think about how fortunate you are just to be in this room tonight, to be, most of you are probably Americans, to be an American, to be in a society where the American dream, which to me is not owning a home, although for some it is, it's to be able to do what I do, come from a family that never made $10,000 a year in their life, and become a really wealthy person, and then turn around and become a philanthropist. So what I want people to remember me as a philanthropist, not a successful real estate guy, but somebody who spent the last, there's a book called Halftime, and the premise of the book, has anybody heard of the book Halftime? Probably not. The premise of the book is the first half of your business life should be for success in securing your family's financial future, and the second half should be for significance. So I'm barely in the significance phase, and if I could walk better, I'd be even less further into it. But it's a pleasure to have had the opportunity I've had. It's just a blessing, and I had a great family like the Crow family who gave me an enormous opportunity, and I've tried to do that for a lot of younger people like Alan and others who I've come along with, tried to share the wealth and nurture them along. The real estate business is a great business, the development side of it. where I've been in is just really fun, and it's where you have a lot of opportunity to create wealth, but to create great places. One of the other organizations that I'd recommend if you all get a chance to get involved with is the Urban Land Institute. I chaired ULI about 12 years ago, and they have a lot of local, maybe not here in Gainesville, but they have in any major market you go to, there'll probably be a local chapter of ULI, and that's a great organization that you might look into. So let me stop there, and I don't know how much time I have left. Can I get some questions from you guys? Yeah.
How would you suggest getting started in development or investment?
Well, the first thing you need to do is get a job, right? And I always tell people, the economy's not bad now. How many of you are graduating in this May or June or whatever it is? Yeah, so virtually all of you. So that's good. You got good timing. I was telling the dean I chaired student placement at Wharton in 1992, and it was a really hard job because there were no jobs out there for people in 92. There was a tremendous recession. It's like you guys graduating in 2009 or 10 or 11. I think you need to think about where you want to live. You need to think about what kind of life you want to have. I got out of Harvard Business School, and I had a lot of chances to go to Wall Street, but I knew that Wall Street, I was telling the dean this, was a 70-hour work week with overnights and stuff like that. I just didn't want it. Fortunately, it turned out fine for me. I wanted to go to the South and live in a place where when I had time off, I could enjoy being outside and getting exercise and working 55 hours a week, not 70 or 80 or 90. So that was the choice I made. Depends on the nature of what you like to do. I think you should think about whether you want to be in development, whether you want to be in sales, whether you want to be in construction, whether you want to be in finance. But get a job in a market that you like, where you think there's going to be an opportunity to move within that company. Try to find out what kind of opportunity there is for you, so you're not pigeonholed and then you're forced to leave in a couple of years. MBAs are notorious for job hopping, and I guess some of that's deserved and some of it's not. I went out of business school to a flyer in Palm Beach, and then when the company fell apart, left 10 years later, stayed 5 years, 3 years, and then 30 years. Each experience, incidentally, I would argue builds on itself. I was telling you about what I learned in construction. What I learned in my first job, among other things, was how not to finance real estate. Sometimes you learn what not to do as well as what to do. But I think, as I said earlier, if you have an opportunity to go for a bank, that's a great place. Or even work for CBRE and in one of their investing roles. And then try to make sure where you go is an ethical place, has a business plan that makes sense. What you don't want to do is get forced to move too quickly because you made a mistake. Either the job wasn't a fit for your skills or your interest, or the company, if you'd done a little more due diligence, wasn't the right company to go with. You all have people come here and recruit on campus? Is that something that happens for the MBAs?
We do. We have a mixture. One reason for our advisory board is because in this industry, we sort of have to go out and find a network for opportunities. And they play a big role.
Yeah. So you can use your advisory board to help. Yeah. This is, the economy's pretty good now. People are lamenting the recovery, but if you go to Europe or other places in the world, you might think this is a pretty good recovery. So I think it was a severe recession with some structural problems. You have here in Florida judicial foreclosures on your houses, and that's really delaying these houses turning like they should, which I think is too bad. But I'm living now in Wellington. My stepdaughter's in the equestrian, she's 16 and a half, and she's riding every day. And I really appreciate, Florida. I appreciate the weather instead of being in New York. But I think the economy is pretty good here. I read a study some years ago, because I had an office in Boca and an office in Orlando. So I invested in 2 offices, Tremco Residential did, in Florida. Because I think the outlook for Florida is really good. Population continues to move south and west in this country, and population growth, household growth, and job growth is what gives you opportunities in real estate, right? Because you need to add to the built environment. So if you have 1.2 million household growth a year, which is what we should have, we're kind of back to 1 million now, when, you know, there are more 24 to 30-year-old kids at home than ever before. So hopefully you guys won't have to go live with your parents when you leave school here, but a lot of your contemporaries are either because they got too much student loan debt or because they don't have a job. But there's a lot of deferred demand for the apartment business and for starter homes. So I think important thing is to get in and get some experience. You always hate people say, I'd love to hire you, but you don't have any experience. And you kind of say, well, how am I going to get any experience if nobody ever hires me? You know, it's like a catch-22. But you're coming into a reasonably good job market, so take your time, make sure it's the right firm, and be flexible. Yes, sir.
Speaking of what you just talked about, I know a few of us, when we got out of college, a lot of us ran into that exact question. You, being, I'm sure you've interviewed many people in your day, if you were to say that to, if you were the person being interviewed, what would be your response to someone saying, I would love to hire you, but you don't have enough experience?
Yeah, well, I would say, first off, if you go to an interview, you really want to know about the company, right? So you got all kinds of information available now. So do your homework, you know, so that the person you're talking to, preferably you know something about their background. If you're talking to whoever's interviewing you, you know, like you can find out all about me on Wikipedia or whatever, so you know who I was. Find out about the company's history, and then you could say to that person interviewing you, I know I don't have any experience, but I've got a good education, and I'm a hard worker, and I really would like to work for your company because I know what you do. I know the history of the company, and I like this industry. And I can tell you, if you hire me, you won't be sorry because, you know, I'm going to produce for you, as contrasted with walking in and not knowing, you know, what this company is or what they do or who the person is you're talking to or anybody else there. Do your homework and then just be sincere and genuine and tell me this is where you want to live and this is the kind of job you want, and go from there. You know, that's much more impressive, I think. You know, yeah, I've interviewed a lot of people, and it's, you know, it's important that you do your homework and that you come across as a genuine person who really is there for a reason. It's like trying to get into college these days. You know, I have my friend Peter Linneman. We were talking about him from Wharton, and I have kids all the time. I'm a Naval Academy guy, and I'm very involved with the Naval Academy and played basketball and baseball there, and so I'm into the sports scene. I'm going to see your game tonight, which I'm really excited to see. And so it's like he said, you know, when you apply for college, you all are beyond this, he said, really let that college know that you've thought about why you want to be in that college. You know, they want to know why you think you belong in that college. And that's why I think when you talk to employers, you know, if you're really well informed about who the employer is and what they do and who the person is you're talking to, or about the leadership and the ownership of the company. If it's a public company, find out, you know, read their annual reports and find out what they've been doing and what their challenges are. If it's a private company, find out as much as you can about who owns the company and the history of the company as best you can. And I think you'll have better success that way. Other questions? Yes, sir.
You mentioned that working with Chairman Crow, you said it's always very important to align your interests with your partners.
Yeah.
So could you maybe give an example of that? Or I've done, like in apartments, for example, would you align with the other equity partners, with the management company? Who are you generally aligning with?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. You align with everybody you can. I was speaking mostly internally, so if Alan's my partner and he's got a site in Orlando and he advocates for that site, and his senior partner, or if he's the senior partner, he signs off on it, and I know that Alan owns 20% of this deal, and if the deal goes well, he gets the 20%, but if the deal goes poorly, he's got 20% to lose because he's got money invested in the company. That's internally. That's really important, particularly the further away you get from the action. But your point is good. So you try to align yourself with your equity partners. Now we would partner with Prudential or AIG or, you know, Boston Capital or any number of people who invested equity in apartment deals. The closer you're aligned with them, the better, and vice versa, so that they know that if the project makes money, you're all going to make money together. And if they have some decision-making rights about when to sell or when to refinance, and it's advantageous to them to exercise those rights, but that goes against you because you're the one that's guaranteed the debt or something. So you want to be as aligned with your financial partners as possible. You want to be aligned as much as possible with your contractors. First off, you need a construction contract that penalizes the contractor if he delivers late. Because if he delivers late, you can't rent the project. You're continuing to pay interest and overhead, but you got no revenue coming in because instead of finishing in July, he finished in November. So in a converse way, they've got to be penalized for being late. But on the flip side is if they have savings, then they should share in the savings so that they're motivated to do the best thing they can to bring the job in on cost or below cost. That can cut both ways, but the management company, yeah, a lot of the management companies in hotel businesses, for example, depending on how much clout you got, are not just percent of gross, but they're percent of the bottom line. So anywhere in life you can do it. Try to figure out whether the person you're doing business with is motivated to act inconsistently with you or not consistently with you. Even employment agreements with people who work for you, what are they bonused on? People figure out what's in their self-interest, particularly when it comes to how you compensate people. So what you want to do as much as you possibly can is write your agreement, your bonus agreement, your retention agreement, whatever it is, so that they're incented to do what's in your best interest too. Because they will figure it out, if it's, and sometimes goals are too short-term oriented. But I think you need to align yourself with everybody who's in to the extent you can. It's an important concept, not just internally. Yeah. Come on, you guys must have other questions, huh? I've lived a long time. Been through a lot. How are we doing time-wise? We have another 10 minutes? Yes, sir.
You talked a lot about, when you're job hunting, finding out about the company, what type of company it is, are they ethical? What are some things you look for when you're evaluating a company to figure out what type of company it is?
Well, I think you need to try and understand what their business strategy is, how long they've been in business, and what their business strategy is, and how creative they've been, and particularly if they've been around a long time. There have been in our business a lot of one-cycle wonders, people who come in and you got an upcycle in apartments, but they don't manage their risk, and then they go out of business the first downturn. So I think you want to try to figure out if they've got quality leadership, if the leadership's been stable, if they've got some stability, they're not always turning over people, because that's a big warning sign, both at the top and at the bottom. And then whether they've been through a cycle and seem to have a good solid business strategy and a good solid equity foundation. Because people that run on shoestrings or that are just riding a wave that's inevitably going to come back to earth are the people you want to try to avoid. It's really hard when you're not on the inside. Unfortunately, sometimes you get on the inside and you find out the company's not what you thought, but do the best you can, particularly if you guys have some options. So hopefully you'll have 2 or 3 options, when you get out of here to go for it. And I wouldn't be afraid to cold call on companies either. If you're thoughtful and you can figure out, okay, I want to live in Orlando, and I want to be, a broker to start my career, then find out who the best brokers are in Orlando, and go call on them, ask for an appointment, and tell them how much you want to work for them and you want to be a broker. And so don't wait for the world to come to you, in a respectful way, go out and seek out what you want as best you can sort it out. Yeah. Any questions from you ladies in the back? No?
Not all the ladies, but so the next downturn is coming, and you won't see it cover. If the next downturn is coming, you won't see it coming, but you're also very optimistic on the economy. Does that mean that it's coming soon?
Yeah. Well, here's my experience see if how far back I can go. So in 1969, there was a little bit of a downturn, just as I was graduating from Harvard Business School in 70. Then we had, a few really good years. Then 74 was the dumps, and it took you a few years to recover that. Then there was a little blip in 81, high interest rates, then that came down quickly. They panicked, I think Carter was in, and the Fed panicked and drove rates back down quickly. Then we had a pretty good run until the end of the 80s. 89 in Texas, 90, 91, 92 were pretty bad. Started coming out of it in 93. This is where my wealth was created. Between 93 and 2009, we had a long run, 15-year run. Now, there was a little tech wreck in 2001. You all may have some familiarity, maybe not. But that was not much of a problem for us in the rental apartment business. It was a little disruptive for maybe a year, and then it came roaring back. And so I had that long window, plus in the development business, the promoted interest. You guys know that concept of promote? Anybody know that? They teach promote here. Do you guys teach what a promoted interest is, or maybe you call it something different? Yeah? Yeah. Well, it's really an important concept if you want to get really wealthy. And the guys in the hedge fund business understand it really well in the private equity business. So, you basically invest $10 out of 100, but you get, after everybody gets their money back and a 9% return, you get 20% of the profits. And then after they get a 13% return, you get 30% of the profits. And after they get a 14% return, you get 40% of the profits. So the disproportionate profits you get above what you invested, I call a carried interest or a promoted interest. That in this country is treated as a capital gain. So, Alan, when I think about where my wealth was created, and I've been there 30 years, so I say made some money along the ways. We did 2 real estate investment trusts, Avalon, which is now Avalon Bay, which I think is the finest apartment REIT in the country, Gables, which went private but still exists. But that window of time, so I don't know. It can be as short. I mean, we're now supposedly 5 years into a recovery, right? So I've seen that window, be as short as 5 years, but I've seen it be as long as 15 years. So you can't run your life for the fear that it's coming next year and you got to shut down. Because I still say you're not going to see it coming, but you got to have your foot only partway on the gas, because if it comes and you don't see it, which has always been my experience, you don't also know, incidentally, how severe it's going to be or how long it's going to be, right? The Great Recession that you all are familiar with here, fortunately you're in school instead of living it, but that's the most significant recession we've had since the Great Depression. So it was really deep and disruptive, maybe 3 years in length. You get recovery as a technical thing, and it doesn't feel like you're in recovery. But so I'd say, every 5 to 15 years, most likely 7, 8, or 9 years, might not be really severe. So run your business so that you can get through a 3-year recession where things fall off. One of the mistakes I think I made at Trammell Crow Residential is I didn't diversify our revenues enough. Our revenues were development fees and construction fees. And then our profits were basically profits from creating value in building apartments and then selling them. But when you get into a recession and no bank will finance a new apartment, pretty soon your development fees and your construction fees run out, and then you got nothing. You got no income. So that forced us to dramatically scale our overhead down, and that's absolutely no fun, because presumably most everybody you got because you think they're really quality people. And so I hated going through that aspect of it. Some of my peers, there's a guy named Bob Faith at Graystar. He's done a good job of creating an acquisition business and teaming up with Wall Street, a profitable, he tells me, property management business, an asset management business, a value add business of buying and rehabbing, and a development business, and a construction business. So the development and construction goes away almost. He's got these other businesses to help carry through this recession. Recession seemed to me generically to be 3 years. So I would think about it that you're not going to see it coming. It's probably, I'm investing again in a new development business in the Southeast, and I tell people when I speak, because I'm old enough now to be one of the few people that can talk about all these cycles, that I think we're in the third inning of a 9-inning ball game in apartments. And I say that because the industry has a lot of transparency since the REIT industry was kind of created for the second time, but meaningfully created in 1993 and 94. With all of these public real estate investment trusts owning income properties, there's all kinds of public information out there about how many units are under construction in Charlotte, how many units are in the pipeline, what happened to rent growth the last year in Charlotte. So there's much more transparency than there ever was. Equity will pull back. And if you look at this last period that I talked about, the marvelous 15-year period, you know, we ramped up in 94, and by 97 or 8, we were up around 300 to 350,000 new apartments, and it just bumped along there for 15 years. Because whenever you saw a market getting overbuilt, the equity pulled back because they knew it was getting overbuilt. Raleigh, North Carolina, right now, where I have, unfortunately, a project under construction, is getting, you know, way more product than it's ever gotten at any one point in time delivered, almost 10,000 units in a period of a year and a half. I don't think there's anybody interested in investing in new equity in Raleigh, and probably won't for a couple of years. Now, the whole key to the business, the whole key to our economy in real estate is job growth, right? So this last time around, we didn't overbuild. We overbuilt in the late 1980s, but this last time around, going into 2008, we were building around 300,000 new apartments a year. Same thing we've been building for 10 or 15 years. What changed was the demand went away. The recession hit, demand collapsed. Well, you had these projects under construction. They were going to be delivered in 9 and 10. And even though the economy started to recover a little bit, you have to go through that adjustment period. So it's all about jobs in the end. And in this country, it's all about household growth. Household growth and jobs, and they're obviously related. Household growth was depressed to 500,000 new households a year for a few years. That less than half, about 40% of normal. Now it's creeping back up, but we need a sustained recovery. You guys are coming out at a pretty good time. Maybe not the best time, but a pretty good time. And I think it'll be a good time because unless something unusual happens, you know, we should continue to recover, sustain a recovery for another 3, 4, 5 years. You know, nobody can see well into the future. You do 5-year plans. I always get a kick out of these people who buy our properties and they do 10 and 15-year discounted cash flows. I think I can tell you what's likely to happen next year, but after that, I guess you got to do it. You all may end up doing it when you're in your new jobs, is, you know, buying a property and forecasting it out 10 to 15 years, but nobody knows because it's never going to be whatever you forecast. It's always going to be different. Ladies, is there anything you ladies would like to know in the back? Are you all MBAs? None of the ladies are MBAs? No? Undergrads? Yeah? Undergrad business in real estate. Real estate majors or not? No? Minors in real estate.
Hey, Ron, you might want to mention a little bit, you were talking about structuring the deals that period through the downturn.
Yeah.
But we made a lot of money at TCR basically coming out of the downturn because we still had property. So
Yeah, we were able to hold on to it. Let me see what do you have a question in the back?
do you have an opinion on the impact of restricted immigration on household formation?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's obviously, I said earlier, we've had about 1/3 of our household growth, or 1 million of the 3 million, come from immigration. So I think that dampens it. And interestingly, Hispanics and blacks, their propensity to rent is well over 50%. So they're going to feed the rental demand. Now, there's going to be an affordability component for a lot of that. But their home ownership rate is well under 50%. Whites is like 75%. And the overall country now is, you may know, is 65%. But it's going to restrict it some. You know, one of the things Alan was talking about is, you think about sustainability, which means something different to everybody, it seems like. But we are just now selling 2 projects in Houston that we've owned for 15 years Houston, if anybody's been paying attention, has tremendous job growth because of the energy. It's booming out there. I mean, I drove around there. I went there about 4 or 5 months ago to look at some of the apartments I still had ownership in, and you'd see them building office buildings, and people would say, that office building coming out of the ground was just sold to one of the energy companies or just totally leased to one of the energy companies. So if you can build an apartment project and finance it in a way that you're able to hold through this hypothetical 3-year downturn, coming out the other end, it's been great because rents recover, cap rates go down. You all know what cap rates are. Everybody knows what cap rates are, yeah. That was what's also been an amazing change in the last 10 years since I've been in the business so long. When we came out of the 93, 94 recession, we were yielding double digits in apartments, anywhere from 10 to 15% unleveraged. Today it's 6, 7%, maybe 8%. So it was dramatic. But the cap rates were much higher. Interest rates were higher. So cap rate, for the undergraduates in the back, cap rate is kind of the going in yield, unleveraged, that a buyer will get. So if you buy at a cap rate of 9 and you put $10 million down, you should expect to get $900,000 worth of cash flow the first year. Cap rates were driven down in the early 2000s. When the tech wreck hit, one of the presidents from the tech wreck was cap rates came down. And so if you had a project that yielded 8 and you thought the cap rate was 8, you were not making any money, but then the cap rates came down on apartments to somewhere in the 5% range. Depends. Secondary cities, cap rates are higher. Older product, cap rates are higher. Urban areas in cities like San Francisco, cap rates may be down at 4 now. So it depends on where your project is. But Alan's right. If you're able to hold through, as we did these 2 projects in Houston that we're about to sell, which we financed with Prudential back in 1999 on a 15-year construction permanent loan. You know, we've got in two apartment projects that aren't that big, we've got, our equity is $40 million to split. So it's been very good, and it's only possible because we were able to ride it through the downturn. So, yes, sir.
Can you talk a little bit more about affordable housing? And specifically, do you think it's possible for private development to actually cross-sell building affordable housing? And also, do you think it's possible to not create a poverty trap for those families in terms of incentivizing them to sort of, pick up and move on to, better living, so to speak, instead of creating a poverty trap?
Yeah, great question. I may not totally know what you mean by poverty trap, but affordable housing is something that I've been spending a lot of time on, in that so much of the housing in this country is not affordable. There's a thumb rule that you should not spend more than 30% of your income on housing. And that's a lot of times people will look at that number when they're deciding whether you're qualified for a mortgage. I think the new standard they're looking at, qualified mortgage, QRM, QR, one of them's 43% now, just came out with. So what I said earlier was 20 million families are spending more than half their income on housing. Affordable housing, affordable is a relative term, right? But if it's affordable to a family, it probably leaves them enough money to meet their other necessities of life and not being house poor. One of the studies we did at the Terwilliger Center for Housing at ULI was we looked at the combination of transportation cost and housing cost. And we believe you need to link the two, because if you've heard the term drive till you qualify, a lot of people were moving way away from their job to find a place they could qualify for a mortgage, a cheaper house, further and further out. But then they would spend hours on the freeways and a whole lot of money on transportation. So you almost need to look at both of them. There's a low-income housing tax credit program. Are you familiar with that? Yeah. So as a for-profit developer, we created a division in Houston to do that. We did 23 of those projects, but they were all pretty much 4% with bonds. They're kind of a ham sandwich for us. I like doing them because I have the mission orientation of building affordable housing, but just as a for-profit business, it wasn't great, it wasn't bad. So then if you can do affordable housing without a subsidy, which is maybe your question, yeah, I think so. Your margins aren't going to be great. The absolute dollars aren't going to be great. If you do it in volume, I think you can make some money. it's tough. These people that I'm talking about that pay so much because we as the private sector can't deliver housing at a price point that they can afford. And so the only way to address it is through subsidy. Most of the subsidy comes at the federal level, but it can also come from the local level and the state level. You know, you can abate real estate taxes, you can allow people to finance with tax-exempt financing. There's ways communities can help create affordable housing. I think it's tough if you define affordable housing as people making 100% or less of area median income. Area median income in this country, incidentally, is about $51,000 per family. You can make some money at it. You're not going to get rich at it, but you can make some money at it. And a lot of people who are just philanthropically, nonprofit, or affordable housing oriented are in the business. Another board I chair is Enterprise Community Partners, started by a real estate guy in Columbia, Maryland named Jim Rouse, built a new town of Columbia. And we are trying now to buy a for-profit affordable housing developer that's focused on both low-income housing tax credit and some moderately expensive rental and ownership housing. Henry Cisneros, if anybody knows that name, is also a good friend of mine, former HUD secretary. He's got a company that's just trying to do workforce housing. It's tough, though. And for my partners at Trammell Crow Residential, I didn't try to in any way direct or restrict them because, you know, the margins are just better in market rate housing. It's tough business. It's tough business. Okay? Anything else? Yes?
$200 billion tax subsidy, tax expenditures that owner-occupied housing associated mortgage interest reduction will be pulled back. Where would you expand the low housing tax credit program? Would you think more demand side subsidies?
Yeah. It's kind of a concept of demand side and supply side subsidies. What I argued, I should send you, if you're interested, I'll send you my Harvard speech. I spent a lot of time on it. Section 8 is a voucher program that exists in this country today for people who have some income, and maybe some of them don't have, but need to subsidize their income so they're not spending more than 30%. So you can get a voucher, and then you can give it to a landlord, and the landlord can collect on that voucher. Only 1 out of 4 people who are eligible can get a voucher because there's just not enough money. And it's still most of HUD's budget, as you may know these days. So I would take the $200 billion, $150 billion of which is directed to home ownership, and I would eliminate the mortgage interest deduction, and I would give money on ownership housing to low-wealth families who have income but need some help with down payment or some interest rate subsidy. I would help low-wealth families who have a job and otherwise have a reason to want to own a home, to help them get into a home, a little bit of what FHA does these days. And then I'd take the rest and I would expand the low-income housing tax credit program and make it available to individuals to buy the credits, not just corporations. So there's a bigger market for it, maybe double it in size, which is what I've recommended. I served, incidentally, on the Bipartisan Policy Center Housing Commission for 2 years. And we were half Democrats, half Republicans. George Mitchell, God bless him, one of the great American human beings who brokered the peace talk in Ireland, he was one of our co-chairs. Martinez, Cisneros, and Kit Bond, 2 Republican senators and Democrats, and we recommended that we increase it by 150%. But I had the head of the realtors there, the head of the mortgage bankers. They were reluctant to take on the mortgage interest deduction. So I'm just going to take it on as a citizen. So I would take that $150 billion and I would spend, let's say, $50 billion for helping low-wealth families who want to be in home ownership, And I would take the other $100 billion and I would increase, the low-income housing tax credit, incidentally, only costs $6 billion a year. That's 3% of the subsidy. And it creates or preserves 100,000 units a year. So I would double that, and then I'd use the rest to make it possible for people who make less than 50% of area median income not be house poor. But there's such an enormous lobby for the mortgage interest deduction, the home builders and the realtors, and I think they're brain dead, personally. I don't think they're even thinking about who it goes to. It's just like a reflex action, because it only goes to people who itemize. I said that earlier. So you have to itemize. Those are the wealthier people. We could have more home ownership in this country if that money was spent smarter. Because all it does today is it allows people to buy boats and second homes, or to buy bigger homes. Almost all these people would buy homes. Somebody, yeah.
Yeah, I have a question. You mentioned a little bit about cap rates before.
Yeah.
I hear some investors talking about making money off the spread between cap rates and interest rates. What's your take on that? What do you think is a good way to really capitalize on that?
Cap rates and interest rates.
The spread between cap rates and
Yeah, I don't know how that concept works. What we do when we develop a project, and this may be responsive or may not, is we look to get at least 150 basis points spread between the yield that project would yield if it were in the market today and the cap rate we could sell it for. And hopefully more than 150 basis points. 150 basis points, 1.5%. So for example, if you got a project that will yield 7 if rents don't go up during your whole development process, and you can sell it for a cap rate of 5.5, you got that 150 basis point spread. Cap rates and interest rates can be arbitraged somewhat. Usually they should track. Normally I think when they came down in 2002 and 3 and 4, the cap rates came down because alternative investments. If you think about somebody who's buying an apartment project for you, and they're not dedicated just to apartments, they're looking at what can I get on bonds, how do I feel about the stock market, what about MLPs, or they're looking at the whole universe of alternatives and figuring out what kind of initial yield they're willing to buy an apartment for, given what their alternative yields on other kind of investments are, whether that apartment project's likely to go up. If you're in a rising environment where you've got rents going up, then you'll pay a little lower cap rate than if rents are flat or declining. Then you're chasing it down. So I'm not sure the concept, but certainly we look at a spread on yield. Was there another question here? Yes, sir.
Yeah, just a question on the mortgage interest deduction. You talked about, before I came to the program, we were making like below $100,000 range, and have a ton of student loans. And I know without the mortgage interest deduction, there's no way we would have been able to. It would have been much more difficult to buy the house we had and live in it. So do you
So you should have bought a smaller house.
Yeah, right. If you advocate, eliminating the thing altogether, you worry about sweeping up people maybe making like 80 to 150 who are really taking a pounding, paying huge taxes, but they're not rich enough to have a second home, and they're really benefiting from the interest deduction. Do you worry about maybe being too broad with the full elimination?
Well, my view is that it's a zero-sum game, right? I think it's, at the Bipartisan Policy Center, we didn't believe it was realistic or responsible to recommend to the federal government that they create a bigger subsidy, given the deficits this country has today. So then you say, okay, if we can't afford more than $200 billion, and you had a zero-based budget, where would you start? I would argue that you wouldn't subsidize people making over $100,000. There is no mortgage interest deduction in Canada. There's hardly a mortgage interest deduction anywhere else in the world. And we are one of the lower home ownership countries in this world for first world countries. You don't need it for home ownership. You can buy maybe a little sooner, maybe a little bigger house, but ultimately you're going to buy a house. So if we could do something for everybody, sure. But if the assumption is, which is the one we made, we only have $200 billion, who should we help in this country? Somebody who has a boat? Are you kidding me? Are you kidding me? Tell 1 out of 4 people who need help, with rental housing, we can only help 1 out of 4 of you because we're subsidizing second homes and boats. It's shameful, in my opinion. Not that I feel strongly about this. Yeah. But listen, I think our time's up. I hope this was helpful for you guys. I am an old guy, so I've had a lot of experiences.